Okay, so we're dedicating this learning to, I guess this is Le'ilur Nishmat Shlomo Zalman ben Mordechai Yisrael Tzvi. The neshama should have an aliyah. The last piece we read was about how the waters teemed to produce the Taninim Hagdolim, the great sea creatures, and all that teem from the waters, all the creep, all the sheretz, nefesh chaya that's in the waters, the fishies, etc. And then it says the birds that have wings on the earth. All that, right, came out of the waters. And then we discussed that. And then the next pasuk says, addressing those creatures, it says, "Vayivarech otam Elohim lemar," and God blessed them. Elohim blessed them, saying, "Pru urevu, be fruitful and multiply. Umil'u et hamayim bayamim, and fill the waters in the oceans. V'ha'of yirev ba'aretz, and the fowl should become plenty upon the land." And it was evening and it was morning, it was the fifth day. Okay, so we just said that Elohim blesses them, saying, lemar, saying. Usually when we have the word lemar, it means to impart to others, to report or to announce. Pru uravu, be fruitful and multiply. This is second person, right? Pru uravu meluas hamayim bayamim. He's addressing, whoever he's addressing, Hashem is addressing directly, that they should fill the waters in the oceans, and that's certainly a reference to the fish. V'ha'of, and the birds, yirev ba'aretz, should become plentiful upon the land. The birds are not being addressed directly. They're being referred to in third person, okay? So let's see the Alshech HaKadosh. Ra'ui lashit lev, it is worthy to take note. Ma'ad nishtanu dagim ve'ofot li'tbarech mikol behema v'chaya. So first, the Alshech HaKadosh wants to point out that if you look later in the next day, on Yom Shishi, when the land animals and all the various creatures of the earth, when they're created, so they do not receive a blessing. And then Adam is created, Adam and Chava, and they receive a blessing. And here, on the fifth day, where all the living creatures that crawled out of the water, they were blessed. So everybody got blessed except for the land creatures of the sixth day. So the first thing that the Alshech HaKadosh takes note of is that why is it that the fish and the birds of the fifth day were blessed as opposed to the domesticated animals and the wild animals of the land on the sixth day, who did not receive a blessing. Ve'od, and furthermore, ki bedagim hirba levarech, and in reference to the fish, if you look in the contents of the blessing, God abundantly blessed them. Pru uravu, they should be fruitful and multiply. Umiluas hamayim, and to fill the waters. Uba'of, and regarding the fowl, all it says, lo nemar, it doesn't say anything more than ki'im yirev ba'aretz, they should become plenty on the earth. So that seems to be a much lesser degree of blessing than what the fishies got. Ve'od, and further, ki b'dagim, regarding the fishies, diber bam hu yitbarach lim no cheach. God addresses them directly in the verse, second person, right? Pru uravu, you should become fruitful and multiply. Ve'el ha'of, and to the fowl, shelo lenocheach, the verse does not speak directly to them in second person, right? Gu kilachar yad, it's almost backhanded, the form of blessing that they get. Oh, and while I'm giving you a blessing, fish, you know what? The fowl should be blessed too. V'hine Rashi zal, katav shenizbarchu elu. So Rashi's approach, right there in the pasuk, he explains why specifically these species, varieties of life forms were blessed, as opposed to the land animals of the sixth day, al shemechasrim tamid mehem, because both the fish and the fowls are constantly hunted, and therefore they need a special bracha to sustain them because they're always in dwindling numbers. And the fact that the rest of the various life forms of the earth were not blessed, according to Rashi, is mipnei hanachash, because of the snake. Shehaya atid lihitkalal, because ultimately the snake was meant to be cursed. It was going to be cursed, and therefore, since it would have been blessed together in the category of the land animals, God would not be able to curse it presumably later. So it was almost taking that into account. That's what Rashi brings. Vihine, and the Alshech HaKadosh's opinion as to that approach is ein bezed dei tikun. There is not enough of Rashi's statement that explains or corrects our understanding of Kol Asher He'arno, all that we have mentioned in question. Meaning that's not enough. Rashi doesn't seem to address his questions. Ve'od, and further, Nasim Lev, we will take note, El Milat Lemar. The verse makes a point of saying that God, when He blessed them, He said Lemar, to say, to announce to others. Vayevarech otam Elohim Lemar, ki eino Lemar lezulat. There is no, this is not an instance where the blessing is then conferred upon a third party. This is not announced. There's nobody else to tell this to. So what is the function of the word lemar in our story here? V'hine echshov ki ka'asher ha'adam shu tachlit v'ikar ha'briya nitbarech. Now, I would think that later on in the story of the human, who is the point and the essential reason for all of creation, when he was blessed, kach elu shnei minim, therefore, since he is the point of all creation and he was meant to be blessed, therefore these two species, kach elu shnei minim, asher yesh la'adam hana'a v'lo hezek mehem, both the fish and the fowl give benefit and pleasure to man, and they do not cause him any sort of loss or damage. So nitbarchu gam hema, as a function of their relationship with man, they also were blessed. Mashe enkein, as opposed to yeter behemot v'chayat u'shatzim, all other kinds of domesticated animals and wild land animals and creepy crawlies, asher betochan avot nezikin, that among those variety of life forms you have the paradigms of damages in the Mishnah. There's different types of the Mishnah in Nizikin, in Baba Kama. It enumerates the different types of paradigms of damage, categories of damages, right, in Torah law, and some of the Avot Nezikin, right, Biprat, specifically Karen, the category of Karen, which literally means horn, V'todotav, and its subcategories, Shemachavnim lahazik, that are, that they are capable of harming. You have in the laws of damages, you have a whole categories of damages called regel and shein v'regel, the tooth and the hoof, meaning damages that one incurs similar to if I owned an animal and the animal trampled on somebody else's field or ate somebody else's produce, or the classic case is shor shenagach hapara, if you have a case of an ox that gores another animal or a human being. So these are all categories, right, of nezek that are specifically learned from the nature of the very real damages, force of damage, which is in the animal kingdom. Not to mention the other wild animals that are also like the snake. We're going to mention all these things. So therefore, since there's inherent qualities of damage, incurring damage, latent within these life forms, therefore they could not sustain an additional blessing. Okay, so the prat.
Did you answer the question about why it's you and then when you said at the beginning that
why the fish are directly addressed and the birds are not? I don't think he's answered any question yet. Okay, so the first point that he wants to say is that if you look at Rashi deeper, Rashi says that the reason why the fish and the fowls need a special blessing is because they're hunted all the time. And the Alshech wants to expand that and say it means that really what that means is that they have some sort of relationship with humanity, and humans need them. That's why they're hunted all the time. And aside from the other animals, they're actually beneficial to man. They don't cause damages while the other ones do. And that's why specifically in relationship to man and his comforts and his betterment or his sustainability, we have these two species of fish and fowl that get a blessing. Okay, so in the categories of the land animals, you have Karen, which literally means horn, which is a category of damages, v'todotav, and its subcategories shemechavnim lahazik, v'ha'ari, and you have the lion, v'hadov, and the bear, v'haze'ev, and the wolf, v'hanamer, and the leopard, or the panther, depending on how you translate it, v'habardalis, and the cheetah, or the panther, depending on whether it's modern Hebrew or maybe the language of the Mishnah, v'hanachash, and the snake, v'saraf, and the asp, ve'akrav, and the scorpion, v'tzif'onim, and vipers. All these terrible, agents of destruction in the animal kingdom. V'chayotze be'elu, and all the various types like these. Lo nitbaruchu minehem, therefore, their species could not be blessed. V'asher diber, meaning it's almost like God reserved them to be an agent for chaos in the world, and it would be unfitting to bless them. V'asher diber b'dagim lenocheach, and to the fact that God addresses the fish directly in second person in the verse of the blessing. V'gam hirbe bahem yoter mibof, and the content of their blessing was much more than what the fowl received. Yihya, that would be ki lema shehu yitbarach sonezima, because this is a classic example of how the future influences the past. God is specifically adverse to promiscuity and licentiousness. Vitsafa, and he saw from afar, shahayu atidim kol behema chaya ve'of lizakek l'she'enan minan, that all the land animals and the wild animals of the earth, and even the fowl, they were ultimately, in the generation of Noach, they copulated with partners outside of their species. K'ma'amaram zal, like Chazal say in Sanhedrin, al ki hishchit kol basar et darko. The pasuk says that God decided to bring the Mabul because all flesh had deviated from their path, from their way. And Chazal say when it says all flesh, it says that basically even the land animals, they copulated with partners outside of their species and they deviated their nature, except for the fish. Masha'en came badagim, where you don't have that the fish exhibited this terrible behavior that was initiated by the generation of the flood. V'gam yesh bedagim. So this point means that it's true that the birds have a special relationship with humans and they need to be blessed. They're not damaging like the land animals, but however, since they didn't behave, they couldn't get quite the same blessing that the fish got. They got a downgraded blessing. V'gam yesh bedagim livyatan sheyatzar l'sachik bo. And also, concerning the fish, there's another creature included in that, which is the great Leviathan, that God created specifically to play with it. There's a verse in Tehillim, in Kapitel Kuf Daled, Baruch Nafshi, we say on Rosh Chodesh, right? And Pasuk Chafav, it says, Leviathan zeh, Levyasan zeh, this Leviathan, Yatzarta, God, you created, l'sachek bo, to play with him. There's an interesting medrash on that on one level you can read the verse that it's l'sachek bo, that God fashioned the Leviathan to play bo in it, meaning the waters. And the medrash says, why does he play in the water? He's the biggest player in the ocean because he could play, he's so big, he could play with all the fish. All the other creatures of the ocean are at his mercy, and he's at nobody's mercy. So that's what it means. So you have this big fish who's the king. I don't know if it's a fish, but this great Leviathan, which is a creature of the ocean. Al-Kain, therefore, since it was included in the category in the species of the fish, Al-Kain, therefore, Bahen Bilvad Diber Lenochech, that is the reason, because of the Leviathan, that is the reason that God directly addressed the fish when they received their bracha. Because I think what he's saying here is the significance of the Leviathan. Leviathan has a very special purpose in creation that God ultimately, we say in Tehillim, he created the Leviathan to play with. So he's addressing that aspect, that category that has the Leviathan in it, he's directly addressing. There's a direct connection. There's something in that category for God himself.
And because of that, the fish got blessed?
Yeah, because the fish are the category that the Leviathan exists within. That seems to be what he's saying, okay? Meaning it notes a special relationship that God has with the Leviathan, which is a member of this category. Masha'en ken b'dagim. I'm sorry. V'gam hirba levarchan yoter mi'al ha'of. And also, that's another reason, perhaps, why God made their blessing more abundant than that of the fowl, for the presence of the Leviathan within the midst of the fishes. V'hein zot tihiyah kavanat omro lemar. And that is why the verse uses the word lemar to say. Kilomar, as if to say, Vayivarach otam Elohim, God blessed them, who? The dagim, et dagim va'ofot anizkarim, the aforementioned fish and birds. However, masheroi lomar, who? Pru urvu, that which was worthy of receiving the words, be fruitful and multiply, la dagim, that it was specifically to the fish, Shu bi riboy ulenochech, which is with abundance and specifically addressed in second person. Ach la'of lo kain, but to the fowl not so. Ki im yira ba'aretz, just that they shall generally multiply on the earth. V'hu me'hatamim she'katavnu, and that is for the reasons that we have written. Meaning, the last point is as follows: that the lamar is to make a distinction, is to make note of the difference in quality of the wording of the blessing to the fish and the wording of the blessing to the birds. Meaning, it's to make an overt distinction. That we're supposed to read that the contents were different. Okay, to hint at all his ha'arot. All right. Okay, this is the next piece. This piece is referring to the land producing life forms that will live on the land. Vayomer Elohim, Totze ha'aretz nefesh chaya lemina. And Elohim said that the earth should produce, or it should exit from the earth, a living soul according to her species, behema, domestic animal, varemes, and that which creeps, v'chaito eretz limina, and that which lives, meaning the wild animals of the land, according to her species. Vayihi chen, and it was so. So Elohim said, and that's what happened. And then the verse continues and says, Vayas Elohim, and Elohim fashioned. After he said it should be, and the pasuk reports, and it was, then it elaborates and says he actually fashioned. Vayas Elohim es chayas haaretz limina, and Elohim fashioned the various living creatures of the earth according to their species. Ve'es habehema limina, and the domestic animal according to her species. Ve'es kol remes ha'adama limineu, and all that creep on the earth according to their species. Vayar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. So just to point out quickly off the bat, right, we have a statement. God says there should be, that the earth should produce, and the pasuk says, and it was so. And then it says that God actually fashioned these things, and there are various different anomalies in what God said the earth should produce, and then what it describes that God fashioned. For example, he said, the first verse says that the earth itself should release a general nefesh chaya, a living spirit. And then later on, it says chayat haaretz. It doesn't say nefesh chaya. And it says in the first verse, v'chayito aretz lemina. And it seems that also the order is a little bit different. So let's see what the Alshech HaKadosh has to say to us about these verses. Ra'ui lashit lev, it is worth taking note, she'amru nefesh chaya, that the first verse says a living soul should exit the earth. Ve'amro, and the verse says chayto eretz. The next verse says when God fashioned these creatures, it says, and that which its life is on the earth, meaning the wild animals of the earth. Nira davar echad. It would seem that both those two verses are referring to the same thing, yet they describe it differently. V'hu kafu. It's doubled. Ve'od. Lama ba'achrona yiches hachaya el haaretz u'barishana amar nefesh chaya stam. Why would it be then, if it's referring to the same thing, that in this later pasuk it relates to the living creature that lives on the earth, and initially it just says a living creature, without assigning it the earth as its domain. Ve'od. And a third question, she'achakach, afterwards, hu maskir she'asa Elohim shalosh achronot, that the last three acts, the verse says that God actually did. What is it? What are those? The chayat haaretz, the living creatures, the wild animals of the earth, shehi chayto aretz, which is referred to in the verse as the life forms on the earth, uvehema, and the domestic animals, varemes, and the creepy crawlies. Ve'es nefesh chaya lo hiskir, and this original terminology that was used in the first verse of just a general living spirit that was supposed to exit from the earth, it never mentions. Ve'od, and one last question, she'achar amru vayichein, after the verse tells us it was so, lama chazar, why does it go back? Ve'amar, and then describes vayas Elokim, that Elokim fashioned. Okay? All right. Vihine, lo and behold, yesh me rabotenu zal she'amar. There are those of our sages that said, Totze ha'aretz nefesh chaya. When the verse says that the earth should release a living soul, you know what that's referring to? Ze rucho shel adam. This is actually the spirit of the human. Vikasha, this is very hard to understand. Ki halo achar kach nemer, does not the verse itself later report vayipach ba'apav, that God breathed into his nostrils a living creature, a living soul, and vatihi lenefesh chaya, and he was a living creature. So it seems that his soul is a function of God breathing into him. And yet, the Chazal are saying that at this earlier stage of the story, this very soul that ultimately becomes the soul of Adam is what's referred to here when God says that the soul, a living soul, should come out of the earth. How does that jive with what the verse tells us later about the creation of Adam's soul? And furthermore, how did it even exit from the earth? What was it doing there? Ve'od, and another question, right? So now we're asking questions on this midrash, which we're hoping to use to answer our initial questions. Okay? So ve'od, and further, ech mechomer kurza nefesh adam. How could you say that from matter, from coarse matter, the soul of man was cut or shaped? Meaning, remember, at this level, at this stage of the story, the earth is already corporal matter. It's not the earth, the eretz of Yom Rishon, of Bereshit. So how can you say that on that level of the evolution of the earth's existence, it could produce a soul of man? Yitzir kapav yitbarach.
So I don't understand the question.
Okay, I'm going to read it one more time, then I'm going to explain. Ve'od, ech mechomer, how from coarse materiality, kurza nefesh adam, the very soul of Adam, could be cut or shaped. Yitzir kapav yitbarach, the working, the fashioning of God's own hands. Meaning, how can you tell me that the soul of man, who we know to be the crowning achievement of all creation, who's made out of God's hands, God needed to relate to his fashioning in a personal way, right? How can you say that the soul of that Adam comes from the earth now at a stage where the earth is so developed that it's already coarse? Meaning, Adam's soul should come from a high place, not such a low place.
Right. I mean, I understood that the soul comes from the breath of Hashem, so to speak.
That was the first question. The first question was, according to this midrash, it seems to be saying it did not. Okay. We're going to go back. Okay. So the first statement, the statement from Chazal is that in this verse, when God is talking about the living creatures and the creepy crawlies and the wild animals, etc., and the domestic animals, to ultimately come, that their living soul should be produced from the earth, the general statement of a living soul should come up from the earth, which is not picked up on in the next verse, that specifically is referring to the soul of Adam that seemed to be latent in the earth. And he poses several questions. First of all, like you just said, how can you tell me, how can Chazal read that into these words when we know that his soul was a function of God breathing the soul into him?
Which only happened on the sixth day anyway.
Well, it's the same day, it's just later in the day.
The
Now we're on
sixth
the last day, yeah. We just finished the fifth day. Remember, the land and the fifth day were the creatures that were made out of the waters, and the sixth day are the creatures that were made out of the earth, and man who was fashioned out of the earth. Right. So here in the beginning of the story, God says, let the nefesh chaya come out of the earth. Later on, he's going to make Adam Rishon, and he's going to vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. He's going to breathe into his nostrils a living soul, vati lenefesh chaya, which are indeed those same exact words that Chazal are mentioning over here. It makes a lot of sense that they would assign those words that significance, but how do they understand it? It doesn't seem to make sense. Yeah. Okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then furthermore, just another aspect of this question is, even if the psukim, if you want to make the psukim jive, conceptually speaking, the fact that Adam can have such an elevated soul and demand the attention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hands, personal hands, in order to come into being, how can you tell me that his soul comes from an earth that is already the earth of a sixth day, which is after the earth of a third day, which has become Yabasha, which is no longer the earth of Eretz, of Yom Rishon, which had all the latent qualities of spirituality in it, etc. Right? That's the next question, right? Ve'od. And furthermore, Ech mechomer, how from the Eretz, which is now already materiality. It's not even on the level, right? Mm-hmm. We're not even talking about the primal element of Afa, right? Kurza nefesh adam. You're going to tell me that the soul of man was cut from that dough? Yitzir kapav yitbarach, the very fashioning of God's hands? However, hine b'pasuk vayipach, indeed in the verse that says that God breathed into his nostrils, katavnu le'echad mehadrachem, we wrote according to one of these approaches, She'amro, that says, Vayihi Adam ha'adam lenefesh chaya. So the rest of that verse, it says, Vayibach ba'apiv nishmat chayim, vatihi lenefesh chaya. That this nefesh chaya, the same terminology that we're referring to now at this part of the story, that's what the pasuk says was achieved for Adam after he breathed into his nostrils. Who shemikodim nefichat haneshama, which means that before God breathed Adam's soul into him, haya ha'adam mitzad atzma lenefesh chaya. He wants to say that man already had a baseline nefesh chaya before he got the extra added soul that God breathed into him. Which means, right, if you think about where this is going, that on the level of life form, of all life forms of the earth, there is a level of vitality of nefesh chaya that comes from the earth itself. And man, because he has an element that's made out of the earth, he also has that, what we would call the animal soul. And then what God breathed into him is a godly soul.
But the animal soul is not actually in the body because the body hasn't been made yet. It's just hovering around.
Let's let him develop that idea because I just gave you a sneak peek. Okay. Shehu, that is to say, right? This means that this nefesh chaya that Adam has mitzad atzmo from himself. Ki hayta bo nefesh chiyunit hakrova el hachomer. He had a living vitality that was very, very close to his materiality. Meaning the level of his materiality had a level of spirituality. Meaning all things that live are animated from a spirit of God, right? Mm-hmm. All living creatures. And that is transcendent, meaning you can't reproduce that in the lab, right? And that it just is a function of living flesh. Flesh is matter, and yet it has something, it has a nefesh chaya.
But flesh is always, flesh is only flesh when it's linked to a body which has been created. My problem here is that we haven't created Adam yet, and yet you've got this spiritual soul hovering on the land.
Okay, so 1 second. So you're asking, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What you're proposing is the normal way of, it's okay. We might be getting ahead of ourselves, but let's indulge for a moment. You're saying that it's like an automaton, right? You build an android, and you fashion it out of plastic and silicon or whatever, and then you give it electronics, and then you give it programming, right? So God fashioned, he took mud and he made a golem, and then he breathed life into it.
Right.
Meaning the life is always contained in God, and when it's time, he imparts and he makes a vessel first.
Right.
That's what you're saying.
That's right.
And yet everything we've been saying about Bereshit until now, if you think about it, is reversed. That the vitality is always there, waiting for a vessel, and God is continually fashioning the vessel and then injecting more life into it, right? I mean, Bereshit, all the life is there, and then it slowly becomes more and more vessels, right? So here there was a latent, remember the earliest roots of spirituality that's latent in the earth now are being, in this level of the story, have evolved into this place. Meaning there's vitality from the first moment of creation that's still latent, that was imparted to the earth to a portion, to all the beings that God wanted to draw forth from the earth, like we've discussed. And over here, it seems that ultimately the nefesh on the level of materiality. Remember this. Why does it have to come through the earth? Because it's specifically the nefesh of materiality. Materiality too has a nefesh, but that part, meaning every being that's made of spirituality and physicality, they have their physical element has its own natural spirituality that comes from the earth. And yet, what we have transcendent comes from God. That's our higher soul. I believe that's the model that he's going to set up for us.
That suggests that when you pass away, that latent spirituality that was inherent in the materialistic part of you is still there in the grave.
Well, we know that Hevel Degarmi is always there. The question is Hevel Degarmi the Rishimu of the godly soul or the animal soul? I think the Hevel Degarmi is the godly soul, there's a whole question. That's a whole sugya about the luz, etc.
Is it possible to say that every creation that is physical has some form of nefesh? The rock even has some vitality to it?
Okay, so we're talking about what we call, from human perspective, living creatures. And remember, you have the order, the classification of species, and then I want to get back more inside, and we can discuss this more afterwards. But you have mineral, right? You have domem, tzomeach, chai, and medaber, right? The tzomeach is the earliest form of chai that we see. I mean, it's not chai. Chai really means animal life, but the order of vitality that we see, there's a huge marked difference between inanimate objects, matter, which has intellect. It could have seicha, but it doesn't have chiyut, right? And then you have, on the level of tzomeach already, you have the earliest levels of energy that ultimately represent life, but chaya, meaning matter, the matter that's of a living creature, that's what we call the animal soul. That's the vitality. Like even a mosquito. Netilat neshama. You can't kill something on Shabbos. We recognize that is something. There's something transcendent about every living creature that you see that's much more apparent in a living creature, right? And like I said, you can't reproduce that in a lab. That's not a function of physics. It's a function of biology. It needs biology to, you can't have a mind. It's hard to have a mind without a brain, but you can have a brain without a mind. Okay, so whatever. That's. Anyway, okay, so far what the Alshech HaKadosh has said is that there is there's a chiyut, a vitality that is latent to the qualities of earth, which was in the earth, which is incorporated in the element of Adam Rishon that comes from the earth. Okay? Shehu, which is ki hayta bo nefesh chiyunit hakrova lachomer, that it had this vitality that Adam had from mitzad atzmo, before God breathed into him a soul. It's a vitality hakrova lachomer, which is close to the substance itself. It belongs to the matter, the material. Vihi hanefesh chaya hamura bo lidat asfarahi, and that is the words nefesh chaya, which are mentioned above, according to that understanding, that approach. V'ha'inyan, and the issue is, or the reasoning is, b'ma shekatavnu lamala, that which we have written above, ki hu yitbarach, because God blessed be He, et hakol asa yafeh b'ito, everything He did at its really, really nice, at its proper time. Meaning, this is an issue of timing here. Be'et rishona shebarat olam, at the first moment when God created the world, right? So, ela shahiyu hadvarim ki mufkadim b'shamayim v'aretz. So, okay. I'm going to read over again. B'ma shekatavnu lamala, that which we have written earlier, this idea that we keep on mentioning over and over again. Ki hu yitbarach, that God, blessed be He, et hakol, everything asa yafeh b'ito, He did right at its proper time. Be'et rishona, in the first moment, shebarat olam, when God created the world. Ella, meaning everything existed in the first initial moment. Ella, shehayu hadvarim ki mufkadim b'shamayim v'aretz. These were the later things, the later details that will ultimately be expressed. They were just existed here on a level of, they were assigned. Ki mufkadim, they were assigned in potentiality already in the domain of heavens and earth. V'haya kol davar v'davar yotzei lachutz davar yom b'yomo. And rather, the whole story of the sequence of creation is each and every thing, detail, coming out, expressing itself each on its specific day. V'hine nefesh hachiyunit hadveka b'chamro, and the level of vitality which cleaves to matter, hufgeda b'koach la'aretz, it was placed in the domain, it was entrusted to the force of Aretz from the first day of creation. Asher b'yom harishon hayabar ruchaniyut, that on the first day of creation it still had it's a spiritual nature. Ki haya meha ma'amar ha'elyon hanikra machshava kimdubar lamala, because remember that the first statement of creation, Bereshit, was on the level of God's thought. It doesn't even say in God said. So on the level of thought, where Aretz occurred in God's thought, that's already a tremendous closeness from what ultimately will become a coarse earth to the spirituality, right, of the level of ethereality which comes from God's thought. Ve'alea, so on that level the earth had spirituality, right, and God invested from that into the earth, that later on it could apportion it as it became more and more physical. Ve'alea amar, and on her, the verse says, or God said to address, Totzei haaretz nefesh. So now, that vitality, which is an effect of the spirituality of the Aretz on the first day, now God is summoning it forth to express itself on the sixth day. Ki lo tidme el habriyot shehitzio zulat nefesh adam, ki zo nefesh chiyut be'etzem. That you should not imagine that all the other creatures that the earth expressed, aside from the nefesh of the adam, that this is the nefesh chiyut be'etzem. Al kain zo totzei rishona. Therefore, it has to come out first. So what he's saying is that because, just the opposite of what we said before, that you should not think, since Adam Harishon ultimately will be invested in a nefesh chaya, but it will be different. It's of a higher form than this one that's invested in the earth. So God wanted to make a point of saying it should leave the earth already in this act of making the animals. So you shouldn't think that what Adam Harishon has is a leftover, and he's actually comes from the same place as the animals. And when it was emptied, or the earth was emptied from this holy quality that was portioned to her or entrusted in her, as mikoch chiyunit, then from the vitality that was the power of the vitality shenitan that was given v'nishar ba'aretz and remained in the earth lahotzi mimena habriot hanizkarim. So it's amazing. What he's saying is tochtei haaretz nefesh chaya. When he says that the earth, it should exit from the earth a nefesh chaya, he's saying first release that which I'm going to put in Adam. Let go of it. Now produce all the other animals that retain the nefesh chaya that you have. Right? Because we shouldn't think that nefesh chaya ultimately that I put back in Adam, it's not, his creation shouldn't stem from the same creation as the act of the animals.
What happened to that nefesh chaya?
Hashem incorporates it back into him when he makes Adam as a function of Yitzir Kappa.
So he takes it out of the earth?
He tells the earth, now exit it now, before you express all these living things. It has to be separated to...
The way that inanimate objects have is not, because if we are earth, us physically were made of earth.
I think the earth retains a very close connection to those creatures that originally sprang forth from it, but it no longer has that. Now, there's an interesting Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh. We do relate to all these things, all these creations as creatures. The earth itself is a creature. There's an Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh by Cain and Hevel that says that Cain was the Baal HaAdam, he was a master of the earth, meaning he knew the land as a creature so well, and the earth is a creature that there's parts of the earth anatomy that it's its arms and its legs and its eyes and its mouth. And he led Hevel to the mouth of the earth and had her swallow him up. He tricked him into falling. So, we relate, the sun and the moon, we know the stories of Bereshit are directly addressed. And the Rambam seems to say also in Hilchos Yesodei Torah, he talks about, these intellects, So, Perek Shira is mochiach that every creature that exists, right, that doesn't have a Yetzer Hara is aware of God to the level it needs to be aware. I mean, we relate from an intellectual point of view, but there's different levels of awareness. I mean, they don't have an intellect, but they are aware, and they sing praise to God, and they know that their whole function, they only live to serve their purpose of their Creator. And when we recognize that, and we sing Shira on their behalf, we say their Shira, right? That's the whole story of Perek Shira. But you can definitely relate. Yeah, of course, there's so many. I mean, tzaddikim address these things. Of course, they're living creatures, but they don't have a level of chiyut, whatever that means. Okay. What? Yeah, that's one of the defining characteristics. Okay. Right, ruach is tnuah. Okay. So ubihit rokna me'ichut hakadosh hazeh, and in its emptying or removal of this holy quality of life that God had invested in her, asher hufkarita, that God apportioned to her and trusted her with, as then mikoch chiyunit shenitan v'nishar ba'aretz, then from what was the vitality that was given to her and left, it was left over within her domain, lahotzi mimena habriot hanizkarim. Then from that the earth would produce these aforementioned species of living creatures. Hotzia behema v'remes v'chayato eretz, and from that she expressed the domestic animal and the creeps, the crawlies, and the wild animals of the earth. Heim artziut, that is earthiness. Mashe enke nefesh chaya ha'amur lamala, as opposed to the ethereal nefesh chaya, which was mentioned before in the verse. Ulaharot hefresh nefesh chaya, and in order to show the difference between the living soul, shehizkir lebehema v'remes v'chayato eretz, that was referred to or invested in the behema, the remes, and the chaya. Amar, the pasuk says vayas. That's why the first verse says God said there should be, but then it says He fashioned. What is that? What's the import of this fashioning? Lomar, to say ki b'shloshet elu, with these three different categories of living creatures, haita asiyah. There was a level of asiyah, of doing. Right. This is a creative verb. Right. We talk about how Bereshit you have you have vayitzar, you have vayas, vayomer, right? You have different verbs. So here is asiyah. Shahayu gufim im ruchan, because at this level God is dealing with a creature that's more kav, that's made up of both a body and a spirit. So now there's two fundamental ingredients that are coming from two different places that God is putting together that speaks of an extra level of mechanical involvement, of God getting involved. That's vayas. Ki nafshav v'gufam, because their souls and their bodies, krovim be'echud, are actually, they are similar in quality. We're talking about a level of vitality which is linked in the earth, the matter of earth itself. However, lo ke'ela chelik nefesh chaya, not like this portion of a living soul. Ki ruchaniyut be'etzem hi, it is essentially the one that in the first nefesh chaya mentioned in the pasuk. It is more spiritual in its essence. Bilti na'aseh maguf. It doesn't come forth together in the with the body. Ki ena misug ella elu chalila, because chas v'shalom, the nefesh chaya that a human being has is not the same. So I just want to correct what I just read before. Vayas, the verb asiyah, means that God, it's a level of asiyah where the matter, it's a level of creation where the matter and the soul are already so closely linked, just on the level of asiyah. Meaning that level of soul is not the soul that we're talking about with the human being. It's something it's the more ethereal part of the earth that's linked to the earth.
You're suggesting that the physical body of the animal and its nefesh behema, both of those originate from the earth. That's what you're suggesting.
Say that again?
Both the physical body of the animal and its animalistic soul originate from the earth.
Another way to say it is that there was still enough spiritual vitality on the earth at this point that it could produce living things. So the body together with the soul sprang out, and that level of soul that it has is just the level that's linked to the body. It's not the nefesh chaya that we talk about by Adam, which is invested once again from a higher place. Okay, just one last little paragraph here. O yomar, or alternatively, al titma, do not wonder, al tzeit nefesh adam ha'aretz, that the Spirit of God actually exited from the earth. Ki halo ein tzarich lomar zo. Really, you didn't even have to tell me that. Ki im afilu chayat ha'aretz ha'elohim asad. Meaning, the verse wants you to know that even when it says that the earth had vitality to express, it didn't create it itself. Even that commandment, the pasuk reports that vayihi chen. What's that vayihi chen? The God Himself did it. God still had to invest. The earth doesn't have its own quality of life-giving. Kihine vayas elokim eight ve'eit. Even these creatures, God personally, He made. They're a function of God's creation. Ki afilu ela yado aseta velo haaretz. Because even these creatures, God's hand did, so to speak, and not the earth. Umagam ata nefesh adam. And now too, when it comes to the soul of the man, however, amor ki eno ela shahaita ki pikadon la'aretz k'mdubar. Meaning, even if you say that the soul of man was latent in the earth, that was just invested as a pikadon. It doesn't come from the earth. It doesn't spring forth from the earth. God, in the interim, He held it in the earth as a locker until He needed it later. Okay? Any questions?
But when He created the earth originally in day one, it had that latent energy within it.
Yeah. Here's the thing. What makes us humans, our soul, can't by definition come from the domain of earth. Because the whole point is that we're meant to be the bridge. So we have elements that are made of earth, and obviously what allows us to transcend has to be given to us from a transcendent place. So our soul, the human soul that makes us human, comes from a higher place. However, if we didn't have that on the level of the animal, we would have a living soul that springs forth from the domain of arts, that God invested in arts in the first act of creation. Right?
But we still
So
are
you see
saying
we have
that
two levels.
The animal soul is from the investment of the earth.
From the investment of God in the earth.
In the earth, initially, in the
Yes.
first day.
Right.
From what?
God's investment of a living vitality, a quality that the earth was like a custodian of life force. Everything that was going to spring forth eventually in the domain of arts, in the lower worlds, right? That was going to spring up. And there's very important, I think, symbolism to that imagery too, that the earth is coming up to God, meaning that vitality is coming from the bottom up on that level of creation, right? So that, we're saying, is a function of the spirituality that was latent in the earth on the level of thought by the first act of creation. But Hashem just entrusted it, so to speak, in there. Meaning, remember, all vitality is coming from God at the same moment. What's cool about the first moment of creation is that Aretz, in a way, on the most way it was possible, was as close to Shemayim at that level. Because it still had not become the Aretz that we know today, which is so different, meaning it went through successive stages. So just like the heavens received from God's vitality, from God's light, the earth also. It all comes from the same place, obviously. Okay?